Hi there folks, back again for another video. In this one I wanted to sort of go off in a little bit of a different direction than what I've been doing recently, which has been mostly based around Middle-earth strategy battle game. Now, a few months ago, obviously, the new edition of Warhammer Age of Sigmar came out and I was quite excited for it. I've been a fan of the Mortal Realms, I suppose you'd say, since I think probably around the start of 3rd edition, when I started to really enjoy what they were doing, Games Workshop being when it came to this fantasy world and what they were trying to do going forward with the narrative and stuff. And over the course of the last couple of years, I've been exploring things like the role-playing game and all sorts of bits and pieces. And all of that has really come together to create a really interesting, fascinating fantasy world that I think more people should really dive into. Now, obviously, one of the big things is that a lot of folks have been kind of put off diving into something like Age of Sigmar because they were fans of the old world. And I'm still a fan of the old world. I still enjoy Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and I still enjoy, the old world with the Empire and the Dwarves and everything like that. I'm still in a Warhammer Fantasy roleplay campaign with some friends and all that kind of good stuff. And I've been really enjoying that, obviously. But Warhammer Age of Sigmar was obviously something a little bit different, and it took the grim, dark fantasy that had that hint of, I suppose you'd say, realism to it, I guess, and it kind of dialed it up to 11 and took it in an entirely new direction with the birth of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. If you're interested in the development of that particular game, I'm going to put a link down below to a video from Jordan Sorcery, who's done a really good video looking into the background of the birth of Warhammer Age of Sigmar and how those initial rules came out. But I think one of the things that was very different about Warhammer Age of Sigmar compared to Warhammer Fantasy was its size and its scope, and the fact that it moved away from your classic grimdark into slightly more of a nebulous fantasy world where a lot of things could be possible and change and warp, and there were larger than life characters and all that kind of stuff. It became a little bit more of I like to think of it as kind of like a retro fantasy 1980s, early 90s blitz of electronic music and metal, where everything could be weird and wacky and wonderful, kind of like those sort of cartoons that we used to watch as kids in the 80s and 90s. That was kind of how Warhammer Age of Sigmar was presenting itself. And for some people, that was really interesting because it kind of gave you a look into a new fantasy world that kind of gave off a different vibe than a lot of other fantasy games out there, which have decided to be a lot more Tolkien-esque or standard fantasy in their scope, which is fine, obviously, and there's a place for that. Obviously, I really enjoy the Middle-earth strategy battle game, but I think for a lot of people, it put them off when it came to Age of Sigmar. Now, one of the things that I think has changed definitely in the middle of 2nd edition and then moving into 3rd and 4th edition is they've started to do stuff like this, which I really enjoy, where they've taken the realms, which are very nebulous, and they've instead looked at things like Akshi and Gur and all these different realms that were kind of put forth during the initial release of the game and its lore and its background, and they've started to flesh them out a little bit more and start to give us things like maps, as you can see here, and obviously everything is still very wild and wacky and weird when you look at the grand scope of things. I mean, you still have realms that float through the depths of the etheric void, as you can see there, based on the various winds of magic. But within that, you then have more concrete, stable locations that you can start to latch onto. And I think that's been really interesting for people to get their head around when it came to Warhammer Age of Sigmar in the new edition. And it's something that I think Games Workshop have done a really good job of when it comes to making it accessible for more people. So instead of, for example, actually the realm of fire just being, well, it's just a realm where everything's on fire or whatever, right? Suddenly it becomes somewhere where you start to learn about the peoples and the towns and the cities and the very substance of the world and how people go about their daily lives and all that kind of stuff. And it's one of the things that I think was really nice in the early portion of this book, if we flip back to it for a second, is that they started to look into the history of the mortal realms through the eyes of mortal characters rather than it just being the larger-than-life Stormcast Eternals and all those bigger godlike figures. Instead, the stories were told from a more human point of view, which I think is a really interesting way of taking it. And it's always fascinating looking into the world as it is now and how fleshed out it is and how far it's come since that first edition of the game and the lore and that kind of bare bones approach to it, really, I suppose, when it first came out. Where it definitely felt like it was just do what you can with it, play around in it, tell whatever stories you want. That's fine, obviously, but people really enjoy a little bit of structure when it comes to their fantasy worlds, which seems strange, I suppose, but there you go. And obviously, Warhammer Age of Sigmar is not going to be for everybody, but I think they've really put the effort in to try and create a more interesting and cohesive world that's got lots of scope for you to take different things when it comes to telling your stories. And that definitely is portrayed in the rules as well. I think the Path to Glory rules have been updated and changed to make them more accessible and easier, alongside the core rules as well, which are always nice to get your teeth sunk into, as it were. And I think they've done a better job with the rules for 4th edition than the Warhammer 40,000 team when it came to 10th edition late last year. But yeah, I think this is really interesting because it starts to explore the world in a little bit more detail, tell you a few more stories about the different characters and who they are and how they all fit together. Obviously, the larger-than-life characters are still there. You've still got the likes of Nagash and Marathi Kane and Sigmar and all these other different characters that are all kind of battling for control of the world, or the worlds, I suppose, the realms. But it's really fascinating starting to see more of this artwork popping up that kind of places you within a part of the mortal realms. So it's not just this crazy retro sci-fantasy universe. It's something a little bit more, something a little bit more tangible that you can sort of latch onto, which I think is cool. And I think the 4th edition rulebook has done a really good job of portraying that throughout. I mean, obviously you saw all that kind of look into the lore and the various realms that you could dive into. And then as they've gone through, they've really looked to expand and develop things like the Realm Gate Wars, which was 1st edition. The Soul Wars was 2nd edition. That was a really interesting one and started to latch onto a little bit more of that grim dark feel to things. The Broken Realms with Marathi Kane, where she ascended, and obviously a lot of the stuff to do with 3rd edition, which was the Era of the Beast, and Kragnos, mighty Kragnos. That was really interesting, and again reinforced a little bit more of that that grim dark element that people like about Warhammer. But one of the other things that I think was really interesting about 3rd edition and moving into 4th edition is it really started to explore the intricacies of the various powers that existed within the world. So, I mean, and this quite fittingly takes us to the factions. So one of the interesting things for me has always been the Stormcast Eternals. I mean, obviously a lot of people will use the pejorative and just call them, well, the negative, I suppose, and just call them, Sigmarines or Space Marines with swords. But I think there's a lot more to the Stormcast Eternals than people give Games Workshop credit for, and they've done a really good job over the course of successive editions, especially 2nd through into 4th, of exploring the slightly more human side of the Stormcast Eternals. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't really get their head around is that Space Marines are biologically engineered, genetically mutated killing machines. They're not majestic heroes striding the battlefield, saving people's lives and all that kind of thing. They would kill anybody in order to get their mission done. That is their rule of thumb, apart from maybe a few chapters like the Salamanders, I guess. But Stormcast Eternals are, for want of a better word, human, but just different. They're slightly uncanny, which I think is a really fascinating way of approaching things. It's become a lot more of a thing with the introduction of the Bleak Citadels and the Ruination Chamber, obviously. But it's been fascinating reading things like this, for example, the Skaventide book that came out with the launch of 4th edition, which actually had a look at the development of the Ruination Chamber and the Stormcast Eternals as characters and how they fit in alongside mortals, and then by sort of following that logic, how mortals view them, and with the addition of things like the Memorians and stuff that you can take into battle alongside those Stormcast Eternals. But it's not just the Stormcast Eternals that have been fleshed out. The new Cities of Sigmar stuff looks really good. I really like that they've kind of latched onto that slightly more old world aesthetic for the army, but sort of tweaked it a little bit more, made them more of their own thing. They're not just the free guild of old that you remember. Seraphon are always an interesting one. The Lumineth are a faction that I really find interesting in the lore. I don't think I'd ever play them on the tabletop, but I think they're a fascinating faction, and it's been really interesting looking at Teclis's development as a character and how he views not only his failed experiments, I suppose you'd say, like the Eiseneth Deepkin, but also his Lumineth Realm Lords as well, and how they fit into the wider context of the world. There's a really interesting story. It's the first of the Cato Ezekiel stories, actually, where he encounters the Lumineth Realm Lords. Spoilers. I won't go into too much detail about that, but their approach to dealing with chaos and the realms is a very interesting one as a faction. They're probably more order than I suppose the Stormcast Eternals are, I guess. And so it's interesting seeing how they work alongside things like vampires from the side of death. The Daughters of Cain obviously have been an interesting one. They were obviously big part of the end of sort of second and third edition. It was fascinating for them, where we got to see them develop as a faction, and obviously Marathi Cain Ascended, the Eiseneth Deepkin, really interesting faction, again tied back into their sort of almost vampiric nature. Kind of think of them as the Drukhari, I suppose, of the mortal realms, sucking the souls out to sustain themselves, but also a failed experiment of Teclis's. Sylvaneth as well, awesome, very cool faction. Been really interesting seeing how their development has sort of gone. I really like that they've again latched onto that slightly more Warhammer Fantasy Battle style background to them, where you have those Sylvaneth who are, I guess you'd say, more welcoming, I guess. But then there are also the Spites and the Revenants and all the strange creatures that live in the woods that will kill any interlopers that even dare to come inside their realms. And interestingly, a very cool faction again in the background, and the stories from Black Library. Some really good sort of horror style tales with the Sylvaneth involved. Got the Caradron Overlords as well, Fireslayers, which are my other army. It's always a real shame that they seem like they've been kind of left behind as a faction, but I'm hoping that over the rest of this edition we're actually going to see more done for the Fireslayers to flesh them out. I quite like them as a faction in the lore, though, because I mean, obviously there's kind of the fall of Grimnir, the splitting of Grimnir when he fought Volcatrix, and then them searching for the Urgold around the mortal realms and fighting for anybody who would give them gold so that they can hope to reassemble their god. I think it's a really fascinating approach to dwarves and that kind of Slayer army aesthetic that everyone liked from Warhammer Fantasy Battles. But yeah, as we go through, let's go through order. We're into the Chaos Pantheon. I think Chaos has had a really interesting update and change over the last little while as well. It's been interesting seeing how the Skaven have been enveloped within the Chaos fold, as it were. Skaven have had a really interesting part to play, obviously, in the story as it stands. And I really like that they've kind of ascended to the Pantheon of Chaos and become part of that larger grouping, as it were. And again, their stories in the run-up to the Dawnbreaker Crusades and then the evolution into 4th edition has been really fascinating. Another thing I really like, and it's kind of exemplified here by Gunnar Brand, is the addition of the followers of Chaos that aren't necessarily following Chaos in the same way that you'd expect. So the Dark Oath, while they may give themselves over to some element of the Chaos Gods, aren't as far gone as the true slaves to darkness. And so they still have a lot of their humanity left within them. And it's been really fascinating seeing how they've developed as a faction or a sub-faction alongside the Cities of Sigmar, which kind of work as two sides of the same coin. These are the humans that were left behind by the forces of order and have had to make their own way. And so they would never throw their lot in with Sigmar, but they don't necessarily want to go as far as to throwing their lot in with someone like Khorne, but they will fight for their own lands and they won't bow down to order. And there's a particularly good book, God Eater's Son, which I think you should read if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Slaves of Darkness and chaos in general and how someone can fall. It's really interesting. It reminds me a little bit of Archeon's tale from back in the world that was. But yeah, Chaos have had a really interesting development over the last little while, and I hope that they're going to get fleshed out. Head Knights of Slaanesh are an army that I think looks fascinating and they put a lot of effort into, but then they've kind of become a bit more of an underground hit rather than, being as big as their fellow brothers and sisters, I suppose, on the battlefield. But yeah, Chaos, still great as always. Death has been another interesting one. Obviously, they had their big time in the sun with second edition, but Nagash is currently licking his wounds whilst his forces march across the mortal realms. I'm very tempted by the idea of doing my own Soulblight Gravelords army based on Kado Ezekiel. His stories are phenomenal. I think French has done a superb job with the Kado stories, and it's been really interesting approaching it from the viewpoint of a vampire who's not just there to despoil and destroy everything. They're actually there for their own purposes, their own agenda, and they're not going to be dragged into the wider politics of everything, even though they tend to be regardless. But again, I think one of the things that this kind of exemplifies is that Games Workshop have really put the effort in to make, I would say, the majority of their factions feel like they fit now within the world of Age of Sigmar. I think a lot of factions felt like they were maybe still holding on to the vestiges of what the old world was. You definitely saw that in the likes of the Free Guild soldiers and the Cavaliers, and to an extent things like the Auric War clans and the Goblins and that kind of thing. But I think over the last little while we've started to see each of the factions begin to find their own identity within the Mortal Realms. One of the factions that I think is going to be getting themselves a really big upgrade in the future is going to be things like the Ogre Moor tribes. For the majority of their range, bar maybe Gorgers and one Hunter have been released as part of Age of Sigmar, and then maybe the Warhammer Underworlds warband. But everything else for the Ogres still remains from the last edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, effectively, and well before that. And so I think they really need to get themselves an update that will bring them more in line with the vibe of the new game. But as I say, they're doing it slowly but surely. It's a little bit of a shame that things like the Kragnos storyline kind of petered out, I suppose. But all in all, I think every army has really got themselves a little bit more of the time in the sun, which I think is great. Now, obviously, that has been an interesting look at the lore and the factions and my thoughts on that. Next up, I'm going to be diving into a look at the rules of Age of Sigmar and why I really enjoy those. It's going to be a little bit more of a shorter video, I would expect, because I'm slightly more of a lore boy. But hopefully this has been an interesting look at the development of Age of Sigmar as a background and a setting, and maybe something that you'll be really interested in looking at in the future. If you do like what I've been talking about here, I'd be really interested to talk a little bit more about Soulbound and the Warhammer Age of Sigmar RPG that's made by Cubicle 7, because I think that they've done a superb job on that in order to help flesh out the world alongside Games Workshop and what you see here. Hopefully this will get a few more people thinking about Age of Sigmar in a little bit of a different way. And if you do check it out, make sure to let me know in the comments down below. Or just tell me your thoughts if you're not somebody who's been overly drawn in by Age of Sigmar. If you prefer the world that was and you want to play games based in that world and you couldn't give a toss about Age of Sigmar, please let me know as well. I'd really like to hear your thoughts because, maybe we can have a dialogue and a discussion and find out what you do and don't like, and maybe you should give this a try or something if you wanted to kind of make the world your own. I would say, to kind of finish off, don't discount Age of Sigmar just because it is a different take on fantasy. I think Games Workshop have done a phenomenal job for all of their foibles on starting to make this world something a little bit more interesting to dive into over successive editions. And I hope it goes from strength to strength in the next few years as we have the new edition on the tabletop with us. But yeah, for all those who maybe forgot about Age of Sigmar back when it first came out, make sure to maybe come back and give it a look with the 4th edition of the rules. But yeah, that's me for this video. If you want to dive into the comments, like, share, subscribe, do all that kind of good stuff, that would be awesome. I'll be back with another video very, very soon. Bye for now.